Hello, good evening. Welcome to another teacher's workshop for our lesson this week, which, progressing on in the Gospel of John, is actually going to lead us into John chapter 4, a few various sections there. There we go. So, the story that no doubt most of us are familiar with respect to this passage is the story where Jesus happens to come to the woman at the well as he is journeying from Jerusalem to Galilee. And with that in mind, of course, there's this conversation that draws out the idea of Jesus being living water. And of course, I would say that we need to consider or keep in mind what it is that we've been focusing on over the last few chapters and building on some of those main themes. Probably the most prevalent theme that we could say has consistently glued together our lessons or sessions over these last several weeks has been the concept of Jesus incarnated in human flesh, heaven and earth coming together in Him, and progressing that theme forward into John chapter 2, where Jesus makes the statement that He is the temple of the Lord, the eschatological temple the prophets have been hoping for and predicting would come when He makes the statement, destroy this temple, in 3 days I'll raise it up again. And then, of course, when we move that forward into the conversation that Jesus is having with Nicodemus in John chapter 3, that concept is built upon even more with some of the more subtle allusions that we get to parts of the Torah. We talked about that last week with respect to Nicodemus being the Moses figure in this story, as he is the eminent teacher of Israel that is seeking this private audience with Jesus. And of course, advancing the themes of chapter 1 and 2 with Jesus being the temple on into chapter 3, it brings back to mind the beginning of Leviticus and Numbers, where Moses is summoned to the tent of meeting with the Lord, where there the Lord is going to give revelatory information for Moses to guide the nation with. And so the Moses figure in Nicodemus is actually going to be meeting with God, incarnated in human flesh, the mobile temple of the Lord, as it will, or as it is. And of course, we're trying to keep that concept together as we move into chapter 4 to better understand this story. So this blue block up at the top, why does Jesus call it living water? So in John 4:10, Jesus answers to the woman, "If you knew the gift of God and who it was saying to you, 'Give me a drink,' and you would ask Him, and He would give you living water." Now, of course, this isn't the full context of everything that we'll be talking about in chapter 4, but it is the beginning of that chapter's contents, and so it, of course, sets the precedent and the tone for everything else that comes after it. So let's just consider a few things as we move into this sequence. First of all, the status of the woman that Jesus is speaking with. So in verse 9, she says, "How is it that you, a Jew, ask for a drink from me, a Samaritan?" She asked, for Jews do not associate with Samaritans. And then later on in verse 20, as this conversation develops further, she says, "Our ancestors worshipped on this mountain, but you Jews say that the place to worship is in Jerusalem." So obviously the conversation is starting to branch off into other things beyond this rather audacious statement that Jesus has made when He is asking for water. And of course, in the exchange, part of what she has to say is, "You're a Jew, you're asking me for a drink." Obviously, Jews don't associate with Samaritans. This is rather taboo. But then Jesus will make that statement that if she would ask of Him, recognizing who He is, then He would offer her living water to drink, and it will quench her thirst. But they're talking about two totally different things. And then as she discerns that He is a prophet, eventually she'll divert the conversation over to this concept here of where is the right place to worship. Because of course, what's been cooking here for several centuries now, since the Jews have come back to the land from Babylon, and then they built the temple in the days of Zerubbabel and Joshua. I was trying to combine the names, Joshua and Yeshua. The Samaritans that are present in that context want to join in building the temple, but they are turned away. And from that point on, they are considered to be less than Jewish. And we remember from the context of 2 Kings 17 that those people who had been implanted in the land in the days of the Assyrian kings who came to conquer the northern kingdom of Israel, that they intermingled or interbred with the few surviving Israelites that were there, such that in this particular moment, in this story, several centuries later, this woman considers herself to be a part of the remnant of Israel. When she refers back to their ancestors, as she'll also say in the greater context of this story, as goes Jesus' reference to living water, she makes mention of the fact that Jacob, which of course is an ancestor of Jesus and all the rest of his Jewish brethren, Jacob dug a well there in this city of Sychar. And so with that, of course, she's attaching her heritage to Jacob. The Samaritans actually consider themselves to be the faithful remnant that actually were the heirs to the promises. They had their own version of the Pentateuch that actually propped up this sort of mythology that they are indeed the recipients of the blessings of Abraham rather than the Jews who came back from Babylon. That being said, these were rival audiences that quibbled with each other, and because the Jews had the upper hand in controlling the provinces of Judea, Galilee's not that important to them, I suppose, as goes holy sites, but they controlled access to Jerusalem and refused to let Samaritans come and actually join in and worship there. So with that, with these two statements, Jews do not associate with Samaritans. The Jews had placed something of a hegemony around themselves to prevent Samaritans from having access to, using Old Testament terms from the law of Moses, the assembly. They're not part of the nation in the eyes of Jews. And then they, of course, have restricted access from them being able to come and worship at the most sacred site for all of the Jewish people, and that being the temple in and of itself. So, on to the first black box. What we can easily surmise, I think, is that this woman is in a position of spiritual exile. She has no connection to God's people or to God's cosmic mountain. And of course, she's in an even greater place of exile, and Jesus is going to draw that out in the early portion of the conversation when he goes to speak to the fact this woman is not with the man who is her proper husband. And with that in mind, she feels even greater disconnection from God and, of course, God's people, whether Samaritan or Jewish. That being said, though, what we can take away in the first gray box is that Messiah is supposed to bring the end to the exile. This is what the prophets have told would happen. We go to John 4, verse 25. The woman expects the Messiah to come. Now, as a Samaritan, it's rather difficult to know and almost impossible to reconstruct this from John's gospel. But we know that obviously they had some measure of expectation of Messiah's coming, and with that, no doubt, an eschatology built around that. Now, without access to the books of the prophets, only having their version of the Pentateuch, I would say their understanding of Messiah was gravely limited. It's almost surprising to see that they even had an understanding that Messiah was supposed to come. So without a good understanding of who or what, why, and when, what she does clearly convey is that Messiah apparently is supposed to explain some things. That when he shows up, he's going to add great clarity to the mysteries that surround the conflict between the Samaritans and the Jews, and then, of course, answer these questions that for her, and maybe for others who are living in Samaria, are weighing rather heavily on their minds and hearts, and that is, with the temple that they had that was destroyed a century before Jesus shows up in the province of Samaria, and then, of course, being outlawed by the Jews from coming to worship on Jerusalem's summit in the temple, which side is more holy, which one is the right one to actually go and worship, and do they actually have a place in the assembly of God's people? So there's something here as goes this expectation of Messiah, and when he comes, he's going to clear all of this up. But we walk that through the rest of the Old Testament that the Samaritans seemingly do not have access to, and perhaps may not even consider to be divinely inspired, as it's written by primarily Jewish prophets, that Messiah is supposed to bring an end to all forms of exile, not just the fact that God's people were carried out of the land by the Babylonians centuries before, and of course that exile has come to its end through the messianic shepherd king figure of Cyrus. But obviously it leaves great room for the real Messiah to come and carry out the rest of this mission, which is to end the spiritual exile of Israel, which has been ongoing, lingering for the last 5 centuries. So just as one particular prophecy to point out here, but of course it's swimming in a sea of other prophecies that speak to this idea of Messiah ending exile, comes from, you guessed it, Isaiah, pretty much the gospel in the Old Testament. In Isaiah 11:10, on that day the root of Jesse will stand as a banner for the peoples. The nations will look to him for guidance, and his resting place will be glorious. Now, I chose that verse not because it speaks directly to this situation in John per se, but in a very indirect way it does. Because in the eyes of the Jews, since the Samaritans are not a part of the assembly of God, they are not a part of their heritage, they do not consider them to be Abraham's people, and have no share in the promises that are yet to be fulfilled through Messiah, they would be considered part of the nations. But while they may relegate them to that secondary class, through the words of Isaiah, we clearly understand that God's heart is still for the nations. And if you read the entirety of the Isaiah context, and of course pair that up with some of his contemporaries, Amos and so forth, we see that the nations, when they are welcomed in to come in to this great assembly along with Israel, it's not to be as second-class citizens. They are welcomed in on equal footing. Now, there may be a passage here or there that may kind of throw a little bit of shade on that and make us think that, well, no, it kind of seems that the nations are going to be subservient, almost slaves to the nations. And I don't have time to go through that context per se. But there are several other passages that make it rather clear and obvious that the nations, as I said, are going to be welcomed in on equal footing to become part of Israel, not just Israel plus the nations, but to become part of Israel, maintaining their distinction as goes their ethnicities and backgrounds. They're not all going to have to surrender that for the sake of becoming part of Israel, and this is true within the church. We are that visible representation, of course, of Israel, as goes ethnic descendants from Abraham, Gentiles from the nations becoming one, part of one tree, all receiving the same life-giving source, or I should say, sapping from the same life-giving source, that being Jesus. Backtracking just a bit, to make my point clear, Isaiah says Messiah is going to be a banner for Israel, to regather the broken and lost houses of both Israel and Judah, and he will be a banner for the nations. In fact, in the sequence of this passage in Isaiah 11, the nations are mentioned before Israel and Judah are. So this is a promise, whether she recognizes it as divinely inspired or not, or even knows of it, is there as a promise for her. This factors into this conversation in John chapter 4 because this is the mission of Messiah. He is that banner, and he is now signaling to his own disciples who are following him and who do not witness the exchange, but they witness the aftermath of what happens when they come back to tell Jesus they found food, they brought him provisions to eat, and they probably witnessed this woman running from the well back into the town to tell everyone, this man has told me everything I have ever done. Surely he must be the Messiah, and then to draw out the crowds to come and meet him. So following the chain, it goes to our next black box. So Isaiah is replete with talk of new life in the form of flowing water associated with the end of exile. To make this just a little plainer, what I mean by that is that as Isaiah is building one of the greatest themes in his entire scroll, and that is the new exodus that's going to come once this heavy storm cloud of judgment that will come in the forms of Assyria first, then Babylon, is going to be a new exodus, the final exodus for not only God's people in the form of Israel first, but God's people will be added to as the nations will be incorporated into that. So it's an exodus that extends to all nations. We see that sprinkled throughout in places like Isaiah 11 or 2 chapters before that, when we are told about the son, the child, born, given, and of course, the governments of the world will rest upon his shoulders. And then places like Isaiah 32 and of course 25 and 35, where we're talking about the nations being summoned to the mountain of the Lord, where he is going to array a fine feast of choice meats and aged wine, vintage wine, and he is going to remove the shroud that covers all nations, that being death. So nations are incorporated into this. They will receive the same blessings, invited to the same feast as Israel is. It's not a shocker then when you consider some of the parables of Jesus talking about kingly banquets and wedding feasts where people beside Israel are invited in to participate in that. He is coming to fulfill the type, shadow, role, and of course, the mission of bringing the nations into this. And his disciples will see, and we have this as a clear exchange in John's gospel to bolster the concept he is building that he lets us in on in chapter 20. That he puts these things there for the sake of us understanding that Jesus is indeed the Son of God. But two passages I would give you, one from Isaiah 30. For people will live on Zion in Jerusalem. Notice it does not say Israel, it does not say Judah. It is the same word being utilized here to reference the nations. The nations will come to live in Zion on Zion in Jerusalem. You'll never weep again, and streams flowing with water will be on every high mountain and every raised hill. Again, I don't have time to go through explaining how this concept comes into being and how it's to be fully understood throughout this portion of Isaiah as it's used with greater rapidity from chapter 30 all the way through 66. Ironically enough, I'm doing an Isaiah class, and we are going through about midway through chapter or the 40s right now. And so there's plenty of material to discuss that's been archived online. And of course, you're more than welcome to come and join us on Wednesday night, and we can continue this conversation. But Isaiah uses this poetic metaphor to speak to the idea of basically Eden coming back to life. That this exodus in which God is going to be drawing his people out of the exile of captivity and back to their land, but with them the nations will seemingly be in tow, and of course they are going to be bringing the dispersed of Israel and Judah from the four corners of the earth back to the land. They'll be bringing wagon loads of wealth, and the idea is that as a real exodus will happen in which the people will come back to the land, the idea is that as they travel back, God is going to sustain them, like the great pilgrimage they took when they left Egypt, walking through the wilderness to come first to Zion, or I should say Sinai, and then ultimately to the land of Canaan, where they will gather at Zion. And so as God was popping out streams of water in the wilderness then, he's putting this imagery there to show that he will sustain them. But he does not mean that he will literally be topographically changing the map for the sake of popping out streams in the wilderness. Number one, historically speaking, when this exodus actually happened, when they come back to the land, there wasn't a need for such things. God was not walking them through a part of the world where there were not already designated watering areas. And number two, it's not speaking of a yet future time when God is going to fully change this section of the world so that rivers and streams are popping out everywhere. We know this to be true when we walk it through parallel passages that come from places like Amos or so forth, where we're talking about the hills and mountains flowing with rivers of wine or milk, and obviously that's not meant to be understood as literal. In fact, I think I have that reference here on my slide I'll get to in just a second. Or Isaiah 35, the lame will leap like deer, the tongue of the mute will sing for joy. Now that actually happens, of course. These are signs of what will happen when the age of Messiah comes, and it's not coincidental then that Jesus actually performs these deeds. And part of the reason why miracles were so rampant during the time that Jesus walked the earth was for the sake of the signs. These miracles actually showing forth the signs that the age of Messiah had come, that Jesus was the only one who could fit that bill. Because these were not ordinary miracles, if such a thing actually exists. These were specific miracles that were meant to show, again, that Messiah had come, so it could hopefully liquidate any question in anybody's mind as to who this man is without him having to claim so verbally, because the signs would speak for themselves, right? But he goes on to say, for water will gush in the wilderness, streams in the desert, the parched ground will become a pool, the thirsty land springs. The point I make with all of that is just to simply show that as a new Exodus comes about and a new Eden seems to be the product of that, as God is calling his people back to himself and the nations are coming with them, these are the signs that appeared with the first Exodus that happened with Israel coming out of Egypt, and that was a shadow of the great and final Exodus with Israel at the head of the nations, all coming to God's cosmic mountain that Isaiah predicts in Isaiah chapters 2 and 4. So Isaiah has spread this imagery throughout these moments, these specific moments in his scroll, where in his oracles he is speaking to how God is going to transform Israel and transform the nations, making the two one for the sake of them filling the world with His glory. Now to this orange box at the top of the screen, reminding you the woman's status was, as she was speaking with Jesus, and then she asks a direct question about the worship of the Lord on His cosmic mountain. In other words, location. So, next black box, we are encouraged here to ponder the words of the ancient prophets connecting the temple with rivers. So, going back to the beginning of our discussion when I tried to make sure we understand we're not letting go of the balloon of this theme of temple building in John's gospel, and that the temple is Jesus, that we're fading away from the concept of a hard stand temple, a place with walls, roofs, and actual instruments of worship inside its precincts. That has outlived its purpose by the time Messiah has come, and that He, as the eschatological temple the prophets were speaking about, is there for that temple to give way so that He, as the new and final temple, can finally take His place and perform everything, functionally speaking, spiritually speaking, the prophets were pointing to. If we understand that concept is coming into John chapter 4, as it's permeated the previous 3 chapters, it should make its presence known here. Without John having to put in parentheses, hey, remember what the prophets had to say about the temple and all that stuff. But I will refer us back to that, where it says, probably most profoundly, Ezekiel 47. Then He led me back to the bank of the river. So in this portion of Ezekiel, he's started in chapter 40 all the way through 48. He has given us very specific dimensionality and using architectural language to help us see this grandiose temple that's supposed to be built once the Israelites are let go from captivity to go back to their land. Truly they build a temple, but it is not according to the specification and design patterns of Ezekiel. And there are all sorts of reasons for that. Don't have time tonight to go into all of that. I make the case oftentimes when I talk about Ezekiel's temple vision based off many different points or facets of the context, but using this is probably one of the chief argumentative reasons that it is not meant to be understood as a literal physical temple. I know it's hard to understand. One of the first questions might be, well, why in the world all the specification? Would love to have that conversation with you, but now is not that time. If you could entertain with me just for a second the idea that maybe it's not meant to be seen as a literal temple, then what is it to be understood as? Capture the imagery here when he is saying he was brought back to the bank of the river. When I returned, I saw a very large number of trees along both sides of the riverbank. Their leaves will not wither, their fruit will not fail. In each month they will bear fresh fruit because the water comes from the sanctuary. So, earlier in this chapter, Ezekiel has told us he was told to go and measure this river that starts out as a tiny little trickle from the threshold of the temple flowing right down the mountain. As he continues to take measurements, it goes from being a tiny little trickle to being ankle deep, knee deep, hip deep, and then eventually it's too deep and it's flowing too fast for a person to go in and attempt to actually gain any measurements. And so the perplexing thing about this is that as the river is flowing down the mountain, there are no tributaries that are listed as joining in with this. In other words, for rivers to get bigger, the river has to be fed from other bodies of water. There needs to be smaller rivers or streams that empty into it and then make it bigger and, of course, flow faster. And as that water gains velocity, I'm sure it's eroding out a bed that's deep enough for all that water to be contained. That being said, there are no tributaries that are mentioned here, and so it's just this one source that comes directly from the temple flowing down the mountain, and then it empties into the Dead Sea. It changes the salinity or nature of the Dead Sea so that now it can teem with all kinds of life, all sorts of marine animals, like the Mediterranean Sea does, although there is no connection to the Mediterranean Sea, and there's no mention of how those animals get there. And we might just simply chalk all that up to being a miracle of the Lord, but there really is no need for that as an explanation for this, because the clear understanding should be is that this is not meant to be seen as a literal structure. Hence the reason why there are trees that line the banks of the river, and they are all drawing their nutrients, their life from the water itself that's flowing from where? The temple. And of course, these leaves never wither. It produces its fruit in its due season, and these leaves have supernatural properties, for they are meant for the healing of the nations. Point being, if we understand that John's argument is that Jesus is the eschatological temple that prophets like Ezekiel have been talking about, then all of this vivid imagery is to speak to the issue at hand, and that is Jesus is talking about living water being the thing that he gives. Obviously, the water that flows from this temple that Ezekiel is talking about is living water. If it can transform the Dead Sea into a body of water teeming with life, whereas now only microbes, and sparse ones at that, can live there, it's life-giving. If it actually is the thing that feeds the life-giving nutrients and so forth into the trees that line the riverbanks, and then of course endows them with healing properties that are meant to go out and heal the nations from all the brokenness of our sin and the captivity therein, then the idea is that all of that too is coming from the temple, the very source where this water is erupting from. Now we go to another section, Zechariah chapter 14. Notice this. On that day, the living water will flow out from Jerusalem. So the same concept as what Ezekiel is saying, assuming the temple would be there in Jerusalem in Ezekiel's vision. Half of it, though, will go toward the eastern sea, and that is the Dead Sea, and the other half toward the western sea. So Zechariah speaks differently. He is now assigning cardinal directions, whereas Ezekiel just gives us this idea of it flowing easterly toward the Dead Sea. For whatever reason, now it flows out to the Mediterranean Sea. But in the biblical purview of the arraying of the nations, the idea of the Mediterranean Sea really speaks more to the Gentile nations. So the idea is that the Dead Sea is an intrinsic boundary of Israel. It speaks to the idea that this healing water is going to be for both Israel, Mediterranean Sea, the nations. So again, in Isaiah's fashion, he is drawing together both nations to receive what is the idea behind this water that provides life-giving sustenance. And in the summer and winter alike, and on that day the Lord will become king over the whole earth, the Lord alone and his name alone. And of course, John has been telling us in his gospel, he just said this in the previous chapter to Nicodemus, that he must be lifted up. When he is lifted up, he of course will provide life for everyone who is bound up in death. The idea of being lifted up, that's enthronement language coming from Isaiah 6, but Jesus' installation as king is not going to be with a golden crown, it's going to be with a crown of thorns. It's not going to be sitting on an actual throne proper in a palace. It's going to be splayed out on a cross, bleeding to death for all to see. Or lastly, this reference in Joel, then you will know that I am the Lord your God who dwells in Mount Zion, my holy mountain. Jerusalem will be holy. Foreigners will never overrun it again. In that day, the mountains will drip with sweet wine. The hills will flow with milk. Obviously, not something that will literally happen. All the streams of Judah will flow with water, and a spring will issue from the Lord's house, watering the valley of acacias. Which brings us to this final thing in John chapter 7. We're not actually going to touch on John chapter 7, if I remember correctly. So I bring this here now because it's a great thing to connect to John chapter 4, where Jesus at the time of the Feast of Dedication is standing up and saying on the most important day of the festival, he cries out, if anyone is thirsty, let him come to me and drink. The one who believes in me, as the scripture has said, will have streams of living water flow from deep within him. That is actually not a quotation coming from any particular place in the Old Testament. It is perhaps a midrashic, you have to Google that as to what that means, interpretation of most likely these particular scriptures that I read for you, and understanding this is what Messiah would do, that he would cause living water to be flowing out of himself to come to his people first, and perhaps the nations. He said this about the Spirit. So the understanding is, as John is interpreting us for this under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, to make it very clear to us that, again, if Jesus is the temple and we're talking about living water flowing out from him, it's not this concept of a literal building from Ezekiel's vision or Amos's vision or Zechariah's vision in which an actual stream of water is going to be coming down. It's water flowing from the eschatological temple of Jesus to the nations and, of course, Israel. And with that, what perfect or better time than to announce such a thing in the Feast of Dedication when they are celebrating the concept of the temple being dedicated during the time of the Seleucid dynasty and Hanukkah and so forth. It just makes good sense for this to be the time in which this kind of thing would happen. That being said, the Spirit is the actual essence of what Jesus is going to be giving to people. He is the life-giving water, right? So I hope that this has somehow helped create a few points of connection for you between what's going on in John 4, previous Old Testament stories, as we've continued to strive to maintain the idea of John splaying his story of Jesus' life, death, resurrection against the great backdrop of the Old Testament itself, as we've moved through these verses and connected it to other things the prophets have had to say. So if no other questions,